Thank you very much. Yeah, welcome everyone to the second generation holiday entitlement and holiday pay webinar. We did one last week, and we've tried to tweak it so that it's not quite so doom and gloomy. It all got a bit depressing last week, mainly because there's an awful lot of ifs, buts, and maybes within the legislation stroke guidelines. But we'll take you on the right road anyway, and we'll see where it goes. So now I'm going to try and get my presentation going. So anyway, background. I'm going to read this bit because I'm not going off piece just yet. So holiday is based on the principle that a worker should not suffer financially for taking holiday. So over the years, various pieces of case law have determined that holiday pay has become a closer match to what the employee would have earned had they been there. And that's obviously the reason for holiday pay legislation in the first place was really a health and safety thing, and it was to make sure that people actually took some time off of work. And behind that is clearly, if it's going to disadvantage an employee to take some time off work, then there's clearly a disincentive to take it. So over the years, the legislation and the framework has changed, and it has become more closely aligned to what you would actually get if you were in work. So, at the beginning, it was very much holiday pay was basic rate, and then other elements were brought into play, overtime being one of the first, and then things like overtime bonuses, car allowances, you name it. It's all over time become part of the reference pay that is used to determine holiday pay. In simple terms, almost all workers, except those who are genuinely self-employed, and again, for the purposes of the webinar and our business, really, we treat everyone as if they are an employee. An employer is likely, in some industries and in some spheres of work, to make a judgment about whether someone is a worker, an employee, or whether they're self-employed. So you might have freelance delivery drivers, all those type of things. We are talking about people who are genuinely employed throughout. So a worker, an employee, is entitled to 5.6 weeks paid holiday per year. And that's derived from the Working Time Regulations 1998. And as I say, it's split between 4 weeks EU law and 1.6 weeks UK law. The amount of pay a worker receives for the holiday they take depends on the number of hours they work and how they're paid for those hours. Again, the principle is that pay received by a worker while they're on holiday should reflect what they would have earned had they been at work and working. So the background to this webinar, and it's been delayed by circumstances beyond our control, really. This has been floating around in the wind for a good 12 to 18 months now, the legislation that was driven by the Taylor report on a good work plan, which basically looked at lots of issues and lots of things that affected people's work and the way they worked and the way they were paid. And within that report, it determined that the previous frame of reference used to determine what was a rate of holiday pay, which was based on a 12-week average, was not suitable for purpose, really, because it was subject to variations over time. People were disincentivized to take time off during a period when they might have earned a big bonus or something of that nature. So what the Taylor report did was actually move that frame of reference from a 12-week period to a 52-week period. So, as you might expect, over a year, you would expect a reasonable average to develop, and it would be a reasonable thing to base your holiday pay on, much in the same way as 12 months, 52 weeks as in the CJRS guidelines. It's a frame of reference, and if you have a complete year, then you would use a complete year, and I'll cover off the variations on that, what to do with someone who's there for part of the year. And then off the back of the Taylor report, the UK government guidance came into force, and I use the term guidance because there's an awful lot of guidance and rather less legislation. And as businesses, we're all working day in, day out to comply with legislation, and life becomes very difficult if there is no legislation. So there is legislation, but it controls one aspect of holiday pay very well. And other aspects, it's kind of skated over. So there we go. So an overview, the legislation, as I say, it covers the governance of the reference period. The reference period being the length of time used to gather information about a worker's earnings to determine an average. So how you measure that pay, how you split it up, how you determine an average, you then apply to people's holiday when they take it. So that was the legislation. The BEIS, which I have to look up every time I see it, which is the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, issued guidance in April 2020, and they then updated it in July 2020, although not significantly. And that basically, it's not legislation, it's a set of guidelines that you can use to work out what you should do with regards to holiday pay, how to pay it, how to determine what workers are entitled to. So it's not legislation, it is guidance, but it is the guidance on which you will be judged. So we'll all be judged on whether we're complying with the guidelines or whether we're meeting the guidelines. And I think, you know, there are guidelines, there's an awful lot of holes in the guidelines, and then you would adopt the best practice, fair and consistent approach that you might apply to many other things in payroll and life in general. When you get the slides, there's two links there, which are to the guidelines themselves. An interesting read if you're bored. If you can make head or tail of it, we deal with holiday pay day in, day out, have done for many, many years. And you still have to work out what's going on with it. Just the overrider there, I'm not an employment or legal expert, and so you do need to seek the correct guidance in making the right decisions for your organization. We're ultimately about interpreting as best we can based on the information that's provided, based on the legislative framework, based on the guidelines, based on our professional organizations that we subscribe to and that we receive information from. But ultimately, as you will see in the next slide, you know, it's about legal opinion. All of the, you know, developments in holiday pay have arisen through legal cases, case law. You know, there are half a dozen key cases that have shaped the way that holiday legislation and guidelines are today. And as you know, as things develop, other lawyers, I'm sure a lot of them will be engaged in, you know, what's the holiday entitlement for someone who is furloughed, stroke, made redundant, etc. In the current climate, there'll be lots and lots of legal opinion. And if you look at legal opinion, it tends to be split fairly evenly. And until a case is, you know, is taken to court, until it's won or lost, and until then potentially it's been appealed, nothing is cast in stone. And we certainly wouldn't put ourselves out there and say we know better than the lawyers. And the landscape of the legislation stroke guidelines is, and I've taken this straight from the guidelines, I haven't changed it, I've cut and pasted it just so you can kind of see what we're dealing with. So this is from the guidance, and it says the guidance does not provide definitive answers to all individual queries, and in some places it takes views on matters which are uncertain. It is not intended to be relied upon in any specific context or as a substitute for seeking advice on a specific circumstance, as each case may be different or different, as we got it there. That must be in the guidelines, because as I said, I copied and pasted it. No, actually I might have put this full stop in the wrong place. In any event, I'm just setting out the picture that if the guidelines don't know, and sprinkled throughout the guidelines are references to the fact that this is, we take a view, I think is a favorite phrase within the guidance. You know, it's not defined in the guidance, we take a view. So clearly people are taking a view. We've taken a view based on views taken by other people. Some of it is reasonably clear cut and some of it is anything but. So holiday leave and pay has changed. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. If you hadn't gathered by now, we've got an Australian theme going on, because we're going on holiday and we expect to get paid for it. So yeah, throughout we've tried to keep it bright and cheery and holiday themed, and you know, who knows, we might be going on holiday in the next 6 months. It's looking good. But 12.07% if you're like us involved in payroll, if you in any shape or form looking at holiday pay, it's highly likely that you would have come across the magical 12.07%, which is something that has been used over many years, really since 28 days holiday became a legal requirement, to measure and to determine entitlement for holiday. It's a very useful tool, and it isn't until judges make decisions based on outlying scenarios that it's gradually been unpicked and started to fall apart in some respects. But 12.07% is really, it represents the accrual of 28 days split over whatever that worker is working. So for a variable hours, 0 hours contract, what it does is it equates 28 days to the unit of time being used, and it accrues the appropriate amount of holiday, so that that employee has a holiday pot that they can take as paid holiday at some point in the future. And from that perspective, it's very useful. And I think where as I say, the legislation is quite clear about measuring the pay that a worker gets when they go on holiday. The real gap in the legislation is in determining what that employee had to start with. You know, did a 5-day worker, they've got 28 days, not too much of a problem. 0 hours worker, if he's entitled to 5.6 weeks and he's got 0 hours, then surely logic suggests that 5.6 weeks of 0 is 0. So there's no start point. And throughout guidelines and legislation, that isn't addressed. And so whilst 12.07% is something that we certainly, when the legislation first was announced and came into the sort of public domain, 12.07% almost disappeared, as like no one had ever heard of it. It disappeared from ACAS websites, it disappeared from HR websites, it disappeared from everywhere. It didn't disappear from our calculations because we needed another way, some means by which we could dispense with that and replace it with something that worked more effectively. So now it's slipped back into usage, so everyone frowns upon it. 12.07%, how could you possibly use a figure like that? Well, the reality is someone needs to come up with a better one, and the great gaps in legislation don't provide it. So you will see some references to 12.07% in the presentation, and if you were to talk to us, we may well refer to it too, because it is still a useful tool. So the topics we're going to cover today. So we're going to cover holiday entitlement, and as I say, that's the thing that is less ably dealt with within the legislation. We're going to talk about what is the holiday pay. So we've determined an entitlement. What is the employee going to get paid when they take annual leave? And then we're going to go through some questions and answers, if you have the will to live by that point, that is, of course, which we hope you do. So the basics: holiday entitlement, which is, as it says, how much holiday does an employee accrue or are they entitled to during their leave year or working period? And then holiday pay, how much are they going to get when they go? So nice and simple split, and it's fairly well split within the presentation too. So holiday entitlement. Almost all workers, and this is quite clear and unambiguous, I think, almost all workers are legally entitled to 5.6 weeks paid holiday a year, which is known as statutory leave entitlement or annual leave. Call it what you will, it's an entitlement, and it's an entitlement to paid time off. It's capped at 28 days, so for a 5-day worker it equates to 5.6 weeks. But 5.6 weeks of a 6-day worker would be more than 28 days, and so it's capped. So a 6-day worker doesn't get as much holiday for every day they work as a standard employee. Anyone up to 5 days per week is going to get a prorated figure based on 28 days. Bank holidays and public holidays are included in the 28 days. So referring to the poll that we did earlier, and I'll refer to it again and again, to my mind, bank holidays and public holidays are just another day. They're nothing special. Yes, they're a day that people may in certain work environments expect to get off, and it may well be something that the workplace demands they take off. But in legislative terms, they are no different. It is an entitlement to 28 days. It is not an entitlement to 20 days plus 8 days bank holidays. I remember back to the Golden Jubilee when an extra day's holiday was added. If it was the BBC, it was an extra day's holiday. A worker might have reasonably said, that's great, I got 29 days this year. But in reality, in terms of their legislative or their statutory entitlement, they were entitled to 28 days. All that happened was that extra day was one less day they could choose. So it is an important point to make, when Queenie gets to the next Jubilee or something else happens of note and an extra bank holiday is added to the calendar, depending what's written in your contract, as I say, it may well be that if it's split separately, you would be obligated to give an additional day. But if it is according to statutory requirements, then no extra day, just a day less to choose. And part-time workers are prorated on the basis of 28 days. So, 3 days per week, 0.6 of 28 days, etc., etc. We'll go through some examples in a minute, just to make it clear what we mean by that. So that's your entitlement. A leave years and entitlement when you join a business. So special rules apply to when an employee joins the business, and also there is a default position if the contract of employment doesn't set out what the holiday year is. So holiday years are typically 1st of January to 31st of December. Very common is April to March, so April of one year to March the next, because that fits in with fiscal years, and very often company years are based on that, so it does kind of make things a bit easier in some cases. But if it isn't set out in the contract of employment, then there is a fallback position, and the fallback position is if you started after the 1st of October, then your holiday year starts on the first day of your job. So the day you joined is the date that your holiday year started. And if you started before the 1st of October 1998, then the 1st of October is the start of the holiday year. So another random date to contend with, 1st of October. So we'll add that to the mix. Of course, it was relevant in terms of national minimum wage going back, but it's no longer a relevant date from that perspective. So yeah, really it's very important that we will ask you, we will expect to know when your holiday year starts and finishes. And it clearly makes a lot of sense if it's the same for every employee. Certainly when you start to look at some of the slides further on in the presentation, and you start to appreciate the work involved in determining a holiday, holiday pay for even a quite simple worker. So remember, in leap years don't have too much relevance most of the time, but they do become relevant if someone leaves the business, because when they leave the business, it will be calculated on the basis of the number of days that they were employed during the course of your holiday year, divided by the number of days in the holiday year, and that will be determined whether there was a leap day or not within the holiday year that you use. So it's relevant. I don't find myself referring to it too often, but it does become relevant in some circumstances. I'm pausing for breath now, otherwise I'll get carried away. So annual leave entitlement, a few things that you should know, some of which I will have already spoken about, I'm sure. So annual leave begins to build up as soon as a worker starts their job. So if the employee joins you and 10 minutes later is taken violently ill and leaves you, for an extended period of sickness, absence, then their holiday entitlement will continue to accrue during that absence. It's not something you get to stop the clock and start again when they get back, or anything of that nature. The minute they start their job, they start accruing or have an entitlement to paid holiday leave. It's not affected by other leave, so the sickness I've just referred to, for example. If you're on maternity leave, you continue to accrue holiday pay, or you continue to be entitled to holiday pay. If you're on parental leave, and of course, flavour of the month, and a few more months to come, unfortunately, furlough leave. So furlough is, if an employee is furloughed, they're still going to accrue holiday entitlement in exactly the same way as if they were walking through your door every morning. And it is an important thing to note, because we've certainly seen some examples within our client base of employers who've taken a decision to, take a workforce of 20, furlough 15 of them, and maybe not furlough the other 5, thinking, they only work very irregularly, they're not worth bothering about in furlough terms, they're 0 hours, we'll pick them up when the work schedule requires it. But if they haven't taken the measure of processing those employees as leavers, or communicating with them that they're no longer employed, then they continue to have the rights of an employee when they continue to accrue holiday pay. And it can come as a nasty shock after 6 or 7 months of furlough that suddenly you've got a reasonable holiday entitlement to deal with as an additional cost. If a worker starts their job partway through a year, they're entitled to part of their total annual leave for the current leave year. And we've got another slide on it in a moment. But yeah, basically, there's a method to calculate annual leave for an employee who joins you partway through the year, and it's beneficial to the employee. If an employee leaves partway through a year, the holiday entitlement is again calculated on a pro rata basis, a bit more precise this time. If someone joins you, it's fairly imprecise. It's based on months, regardless of the day in which they joined you. However, if they leave, it's based on calendar days. And if they joined you and left you in the same year, then it would be based on calendar days. So a lack of consistency, which we've all come to know and love these days. Why be consistent when you can make things different? Unused holiday entitlement can be used as part of the notice period. So makes sense, really. You can plan in, either the employer or the employee with the appropriate notice can plan in holiday as part of a notice period. An employer should ensure all employees take their statutory holiday entitlement. Discouraging is not permitted by law. So basically the statutory element, and this is, I will make the distinction between UK and EU law at this point because it is relevant to the carry forward of holiday. The 20 days you can't carry forward. That's, well, until furlough arrived, you couldn't carry forward anyway. So it was set in stone, you had to use that part of your holiday. The 8 days were kind of floating around, you could carry those forward. Then any contractual element you can do what you like with, really, as long as you meet the legislative requirements and you're not infringing your contract of employment, then you can do what you like with the bits and pieces that you've added on as an employer. And then an employee can carry over unused holiday as set by legislation. So obviously furloughing of workers, that allowed employers to carry forward holiday for 2 years, which wasn't previously allowed. So it's given some scope. Clearly, if an employee can't take holiday, then there needed to be some route by which they could carry it forward into the next year, which was dealt with through legislation. There are also other scenarios that are kind of a bit grayer. Yeah, the favourite, the one that comes up time and time again, really, is maternity leave. Someone's on maternity leave and it straddles the end of the holiday year. It's a bit of a grey one whether they're entitled to carry it forward or whether they're not. The safety first option that people always, or nearly always, adopt is to allow it to carry forward. The other options are to take it at the beginning. So yeah, it's a brave employer that would say no, but I'm pretty sure that there's no definitive case law that says you couldn't enforce it if you wanted to risk the wrath of a lawyer or two. But most people don't really go for that if they can avoid it. So new starters accrual system, which applies in the first year of employment only. So it's a one-time only opportunity to boost your holiday pot by starting on the 31st of the month. Great idea if you could plan it that way. So an employer can only use an accrual system to work out a worker's leave during the first year of their job. And a worker will accrue 1/12 of their leave in each month for every month from the first day of employment. So for every month of the holiday year, they will accrue 1/12 of their annual entitlement. For a 5.6 weeks, 28 days, a normal kind of worker, they're going to accrue it at the rate of 2.33 days per month. Additionally, that will be rounded up to the nearest half day. So given the example there of Mary, who starts on the 13th of February, she's accruing holiday for 11 months. And we're using the normal calendar year, 1st of January to the 31st of December. So she started halfway through the second month, but she gets the benefit of a full month's entitlement for February, and then for the rest of the year. So she gets 11 months entitlement. 11 times 2.33 is whatever it is. I haven't got an answer there. She really should have an answer, but we can do the maths in a minute. But the important thing is that you're accruing a whole month's entitlement, even though you may not have worked a whole month in the first month. You can also not allow a worker to take holiday until they've accrued it in that first year. So, if someone joins you day one and says, I want 6 months off, well, you can always say no to holiday, of course, but in those circumstances, you'd be well within your rights to do it. So there we go. All right, now, what about leavers? So leavers, a few important points to note here. An employer must not deduct monies for excess holidays taken from an employee's final pay. So we've calculated the entitlement as at the point in time they leave, and that is done by taking the number of days that they worked in the year, and not the number of days they worked, the number of days they were employed in the holiday year in which they left. So that will give you the total number of days entitlement. You divide that by the total number of days in that holiday year. So it could be 365 and it could be 366. Not going to make an awful lot of difference, to be fair. And lots of people round it up anyway. But you might come in with a positive figure and you might come in with a negative figure. Positive figure, not a problem. Give them some extra money when they leave for holiday earned but not taken, and everyone's happy. When you deduct it from their final pay, as an employer, they may have had significantly more holiday than they were entitled to. Unless you have it covered in your contract or in your contract of employment and or your handbook to which it refers, then you can't just take the money out of their final pay. It is an unlawful deduction of monies, like it or not. Common sense says you should be able to do it. My employer brain says I want to do it, I'm going to do it, but be aware that it's not something that you are entitled to do unless you have it covered within your contract of employment. So yeah, an important point to make, really. Just make sure that what you're doing is above board in terms of what you're allowed to do. So looking at contracts of employment for a moment, the things that probably should be in it. Contracts of employment are weird things. Some have loads and loads of stuff in them, some have rather less. If it isn't covered in legislation, so if the legislation doesn't tell you it's the case, then you need to make sure it's in there, especially if it differs in some way. So my advice, I give this advice, always have done, refer to 28 days holiday, 5.6 weeks. Do not mention public or bank holidays. What relevance do they have? And as I say, they're just a normal day. And the other couple of things, really. One is that for a worker who works Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you get into the complications of, well, Friday is my normal working day. It's a bank holiday. Do I get an extra day? How does that work? If you don't reference them and they were, for example, entitled to 16.4 days on a pro rata basis, it really doesn't matter, does it? If it's a day's holiday, they've taken it, you deduct it from their balance. If not, you don't. So it makes life an awful lot simpler. The other thing is, depending where bank holidays fall and how long your employee's been with you, I've certainly come across the situation on plenty of occasions where, because of the placement of a bank holiday and the length of the employment, you can end up paying a worker less than you would be obligated to do under legislation by making references to bank holidays and calculating on the basis of 20 days and not 28. If you calculate it on the basis of 20 days and there wasn't a bank holiday in that particular period of time, then you're going to come out with a figure less than the legislation requires. It's quite simple, really. So be aware of that. It's unusual, relatively unusual. I've never done the maths. I'm sure that there's a probability theorem that could determine how often it would happen, but it does happen, and we try to point it out and say, actually, we've needed to top it up because your contract of employment is less than it should be. But yeah, why HR companies and such like insist on splitting it out, I do not know. Because, you just had another sentence requiring that employee to take those days off as paid annual, as part of their leave entitlement. You've then got the best of both worlds. They get their bank holidays off as paid, but you don't leave yourself open. Annual leave year. So make sure your contract says what the annual leave year is, bearing in mind that if you don't tell the employee through your contract of employment, the law steps in and decides that it is the first day of their employment. For anyone who's joined you in recent past. Again, making reference to leap years where that's appropriate. You need to set out how much untaken holiday can be rolled over to the following year. So within the constraints of legislation requiring that part of that holiday you can't roll over under normal circumstances. If there's any side issues, you do allow that 8 days to be played with in some form, or you have some contractual element that you allow to be moved from one year to the next. It needs to be set out, and clearly it needs to be in line with legislation. Holiday taken in excess of prorated amount will be deducted, so cover it off. Make sure it isn't an issue by telling the employee day one that that's what's going to happen. You will recover it from your final pay. Limit the amount of holiday to be taken in a quarter to represent the amount accrued. So managing your holiday is what that boils down to, not giving employees loads of holiday when they haven't accrued it. You are the employer. You have you're in control of holiday. You can determine when it's taken, how it's taken. Obviously you need to look after your employees, and there's a side issue of making sure that you don't do anything too radical to upset them, but you can control it. You give them the right notice. You can say, take a week off. You haven't decided, take it. So all those things can happen. If you can, explain how holiday entitlement and holiday pay will be calculated. Not easy in some circumstances, difficult for us to do, as you'll see. If you're a 0 hours contract worker or something like that, it's you start on day one, the employer has no real idea what you're going to work, and he's expected to sit down and explain how much holiday you'll have and how you can take it. Not easy. We'll give you some ideas of how you might do it, but that's where fairness and consistency and looking at the legislation and applying it in those circumstances is important. And standardizing across all employees or tiers of employees, try and keep it simple, keep groups of employees or all employees to the same, singing to the same tune, really. If they're all doing the same thing, that question, how much entitlement have I got, becomes a bit easier. It certainly becomes easier for us because we'll calculate on the basis of what we hold, and unless you've told us definitively what you're doing, it's much easier if you do the same for everyone. Right, okay, I couldn't make out what to do with this slide. I was going to do lots and lots and ended up doing very little, so that's a shame, really. This is an extract from a contract of employment that one of our clients has used. Quite wordy, lots of stuff in it, lots of good stuff. They broke my golden rule. I don't like it, but there we go. I would certainly have rewritten it. You're entitled to 28 days holiday a year, calculated at a rate of 1/52nd. Whether you need to, so I just have some notes. I'm obviously making extraneous noises, must be tapping my feet or something. Apologies for that. I do have a habit of doing that when I get tense and nervous and start twitching. Yeah, so during your first so there's lots of things in there that are important. Some of them are set out in legislation though, so there's no need to put them in your contract of employment. I mean, you know, you're entitled to 28 days. Yeah, no harm in that. The way you calculate it, legislation dictates that. You can write something in a contract of employment, but the legislation overrides anything that's there. You can't write out something that is a worker's entitled to. So, you know, I always liken it to tax and national insurance. You don't need to put how to calculate it in your contract of employment because it's legislation and it's done according to statutory requirements, not a problem. But if you're going to put it in there, make sure it's right and compliant, of course. As I say, I put the bits in yellow that I particularly dislike. I dislike references to bank holidays. You'll get that by now. I'm trying not to mention it again. Don't say it. I go off on my soapbox. Part-time employees are entitled to prorated holidays. So again, you know, whether it needs to be there or not. I mean, you know, some contracts of employment are excessive in their length and include things that perhaps don't need to be included. Others, I could have picked an example which was perhaps 3 lines was expected to cover everything, and that was probably a little short of the mark. So make sure it covers what you need it to cover. Supplement it with an employee handbook if you have one, so you can make changes to the handbook without filling about with documents all the time. But yeah, just be aware the contract of employment will potentially place additional requirements on you. Be aware of what they are and make sure they're commensurate with what you do and what you want them to be. So a few examples of entitlement. We'll go from basic, better, best, I think. So, you know, we started off with a baseline example of a 5-day worker, Monday to Friday. Apparently 83% of the workforce are employed on a full-time basis, salaried. It seems a bit out of date now. I imagine it's less than that, but the majority of the workforce are probably employed on this type of basis. Whether they all work 5 days is another question, but we've picked a 5-day worker, I think, because it works nicely. We called him Fixed Fred because he's, you know, salt of the earth type of guy, runs around your business doing what you want, and you know when he's there 8:30 on a Monday morning and he leaves at 4:30 on a Monday afternoon, comes back Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, good as gold, no problem at all. And from a holiday perspective, he's a joy. I mean, he might do the job, he might not, but holiday calculations are a breeze with this guy, because that might complicate it, but this guy, he just does what he needs to do. So we put some of the important points along the side there. I've got a message flashed up that says my internet connection is unstable, so if I disappear, I apologize. It's not part of the presentation, it's one of those unfortunate events. So Fred works 5 days a week. He's entitled to 5.6 weeks of holiday entitlement as legislation requires. And in his case, that equates to 28 days of annual leave. So I do use 28 days and 5 days per week, 5.6 weeks interchangeably, because for Fixed Fred, you can replace one with the other. So 5.6 weeks, 5-day week is 28 days. And the holiday year for him runs from April to March. And he started on the 30th of January. So he started very near the end of the month. But the important thing is he did start in January and not February. He could have started on the 1st of February and it would be different calculation. But this guy, he started on the 30th of January. So we need to take into account the number of the number of months in which he has worked. So we would take his total entitlement, annual entitlement, and we would apportion it on a monthly basis. So on the right hand side, you see in orange is annual leave. We've taken his statutory entitlement, 28 days. We divided it by 12 to split it evenly over the 12 months of the year. And then we've multiplied it by the months in which he has worked. So he has worked he's entitled to 28 days. And that is split equally over 12 months. It is 2.33 days per month times 3 for the 3 months. 2.33 times 3 is 7. Nice round number. So we don't need to round it up or anything like that. If it come out 7.2, we would have needed to round it up to 7.5. If it come out at 7.7, we would have needed to round it up to 8. But in this case, it came out at a nice round number. So basically a simple apportionment of holiday year, split it across holiday leave, split it across the year, and then multiply it by the number of months in which he was employed. So fixed Fred, he's a star, no problem at all with this guy. You got part-time Pam, really she's not a problem either. I mean, she's great, she turns up, just comes in a little less often really, but she's no trouble. So again, we're operating on the same principles. We're looking at her full-time equivalent. You know, she works 3 days a week, 60% of a full-timer. She's entitled to 28 days annual leave, but this time we need to prorate it according to the days she worked. So her entitlement in days is going to be 3 days per week, and she is entitled to 5.6 days. 5.6 times 3 is 16.8 days. So her total entitlement for the year will be 16.8 days. Yeah, there's loads of ways to kind of approach the calculation as long as you come out with the right answer. I mean, I would just, yeah, 3/5 of full-time entitlement. You can call it what you will, but again, you know, nothing complicated about it. It's a straightforward working pattern, and shouldn't present too many difficulties, hopefully. But it would do if she worked bank holidays and stuff and you had them mentioned separately. Oh, we're going to mention that again. Right, okay. Holiday entitlement. Compressed Colin only became known to me really when we were looking at these presentations and the legislation, or sorry, the guidelines, if only there was legislation. So compressed Colin comes into being within the guidelines. What Colin is, I don't know what you'd know him as, but he works, yeah, a normal week, or he works a week, so he works his working hours over a weekly pattern. The difference with Colin is the fact that a working day can be a different number of hours. So in this case, this is where we receive payroll submissions from clients and they say pay 4 days holiday. Now, if it was for compressed Colin, 4 days holiday could be 4 9-hour days, 36, or it could be 4 6-hour days, 24, or it could be somewhere in the middle, which is why we then need to look at it a bit more closely and decide, okay, days are great, but actually they don't give us everything we need to do what we need to do. So where these type of working patterns apply, we need to turn it into a number of hours. So then we can start to get to grips with it and deduct hours taken from hours entitlement to get a rolling, you know, entitlement at that point in time. So we've got the calculations there. Annual leave in days is going to be the statutory entitlement in weeks. 5.6 is always 5.6 weeks, unless you're a 6-day worker, over the number of days worked. So, and we're going to convert that into hours. So, oh, sorry, I've got it below. So 5.6 weeks and 4 days per week. So the entitlement in days is 22.4 days. So very similar to the number of days that you would have for a 4-day worker, exactly the same, in fact. But the difference here is we need to define it a little more closely and decide what an hour, or sorry, what a day constitutes in terms of hours. How many hours is he entitled to? Because he could choose to take, you know, less Monday and Wednesdays, or he could take a load of Tuesday and Thursdays. So we need to have that start point from which we can deduct. So in order to convert it to hours, we're taking the number of hours in his the number of hours he works in a week, and we're dividing it by the number of days to get a daily amount, and then we're multiplying it by 22.4 days, which is his entitlement, to get 168 hours. So he's got 30 hours and he gets those. That's his weekly number. So his daily figure would be 7.5 hours. 7.5 hours is his average day, if you like, and he gets 22.4 average days, and therefore 22.4 times 7.5 is 168. So he's got a pot, 168 hours he can take, and then he can take them how he likes. So he can take some 6-hour days, some 9-hour days, however you wish to do it, really, or however he wishes to do it. But the important thing is, you can't just operate compressed Colin on a daily basis. You need to get down into the detail and start to look at hours. But still, with the overrider, we're still talking about weeks. The entitlement is always 5.6 weeks. We don't want to lose sight of that. Got shift work Sharon. She's yet another variation on a theme. Sharon is working slightly different. She's working on a 14-day rolling shift pattern. So, if you're in a care environment, hospice or something like that, then you're probably going to see a few of these type of working patterns floating around. But the shifts are always the same length, so you can deal with a shift as opposed to needing to break it down into hours. Although, of course, if they're in the habit of taking half a shift, you might take half a shift's holiday, you might still want to turn it into hours to get to enable you to do that. But in this case, we're looking at a 14-day rolling shift pattern. She's working 6 12-hour shifts over that time. And like everyone else in the world, she's entitled to 28 days of annual leave a year. And I say that, of course, if she'd have been doing 12 shifts over 14 days, then she wouldn't be entitled to a higher number of days. So to determine the average number of shifts per week, we look at the number of shifts and divide it by the shift pattern, multiply it by the 7 days in the week. So 6 over 14 times 7. So she's averaging 3 shifts per week. I mean, it was a nice tidy one, 14 days, 2 each. We could have just divided 6 by 2. But anyway, she's entitled to 3 shifts per week. And her annual entitlement is going to be 5.6 statutory entitlement times 3 shifts per week. And her entitlement is therefore 16.8 shifts. As I say, that would be a maximum. If she did more than 5 shifts per week, it would be a capped figure. And you can also split it down into hours if you wish to do so, depending on how people take their holiday. And then we move on to ad hoc, Andrea, and this is where guidelines and legislation start to fray at the edges. And if you tap ad hoc, Andrea, into a calculator, HMRC calculator, and ask it to tell you how many hours entitlement she is entitled to, it will say something along the lines of, I don't think the calculator says this, but this is in the guidelines, but it certainly won't give you a figure. There are no regulations on how to convert the entitlement into days or hours for workers with irregular hours. So it's difficult, isn't it? Someone has just joined you, they're going to work irregular hours. You don't know how many irregular hours they're going to work. You can't even guess, especially in the current climate. I mean, you don't know what you're going to do from one day to the next, potentially. Things are constantly changing. And this is where we start to fall back on the old ways of doing it to an extent. I think where we've kind of refined it a little bit in very many cases, we would have we very often calculated holiday pots as a monetary value. So, we might accrue 12.07 or 12.07 pence for every pound of monetary earnings that employee was going to get. And that wouldn't have been far out. You can kind of, you can make an argument for it in any case, or you could. Now you're really limited with that, because the legislation is all about how to apply, how much money they get. So you couldn't, if they had an increase in their rate of pay, their weekly rate, if you were accruing it as a monetary value, then that wouldn't be reflected in your pot, so to speak. So I think the middle ground now is really, you have to, one way or another. No one will give you any guidance as to what 5.6 weeks looks like for Andrea. No one knows. The guidelines don't cover it. There's no real answer. So you are in the realms of fairness and consistency, best practice, making sure that those basics of the employee getting equivalent pay when they're off work as if they would get when they were in work. You have to bring those into play. And I would still be very tempted to use 12.07% as a good start point. You know, if they've worked 118 hours, you know, and their pay rate didn't change, then 12.07%, 14.24 hours accrued does equate to 5.6 weeks. But you can also make arguments for, you know, 12-week average. Everyone used 12-week average historically. You use it in reference to other calculations. So you could continue to use that. Should you be using a 52-week average? Because now the legislation is looking at 52 weeks over 104-week maximum. So should you be carrying it forward backwards further? I'm still of the opinion that, you know, a pot based on 12.07% is not going to be far away from compliance, and it's very difficult to see any other way of doing it, because you have to have a start point. You can apply the legislation and you can apply it to both entitlement and to pay, but it doesn't work out in the way it should. Because you don't have a start point. You don't know where the 5.6 weeks begins and ends. You know, an employee could just continue to take weeks and weeks and weeks based on a calculation at that point in time. You have to have, you know, a maximum. You have to have a start point, and that's to my mind where the legislation has fallen, you know, has fallen short. But it doesn't seek to legislate for the entitlement side of it. It, you know, in no shape or form anywhere does it seek to, you know, to bring the entitlement. What it's doing is saying what you must get paid for your 5.6 weeks of statutory entitlement. It makes no reference to where you're going to get that from. So that's where the difficulties lie with entitlement. It's in those ad hoc 0 hours contracts that are very much very popular these days, very common, as they have to be with a changing world forward. Okay, so we'll have a quick recap on entitlement before we move into the payment, which is where the fun starts. That's where the legislation really has, you know, told us what to do, which is good. So we need to fully understand holiday legislation. No mean feat when legislation is really not comprehensive in respect of entitlement. Great big yawning gaps. You can drive your truck through them and you won't touch the sides. So, but you need to understand how it works. The principle involved really is that an employee who is on holiday should be receiving the same pay as if they were there. The whole holiday pay thing is based on that. It shouldn't in any way be disadvantaged because they've taken a week's holiday. So that's, if you keep that in mind throughout, you know, if you bore that in mind 5 years ago, you would have seen exactly where the legislation was going to go, because, you know, clearly every step of the way has moved closer to alignment of the two. Be in control of your employee contractual holiday entitlement. So yeah, if you have contractual entitlement over and above your statutory requirements, then you obviously need to control it. And it gets more complicated then, because you are able to carry things forward if you wish to, and do things that you couldn't possibly do with statutory stuff. Use weekly hours for monthly paid staff. Right, this will all become clear in a slide or two's time, I think, because when the holiday pay guidelines and legislation were put in place, they deal exclusively with weekly hours. Everything is based on weeks. I know that employees work monthly. You don't need to tell me. We get it. Unfortunately, the legislators and lawyers that put these things in place didn't quite bring it into play. So the whole legislative framework is based on weekly hours. And if you take it to the nth degree, it means that you have to know, for a monthly worker who has done some overtime or is going to get some sort of enhanced payment, you need to know when that took place, because it will affect holiday pay, or it could potentially. I mean, I think it's a step too far, and it's very difficult for anyone to actually apply. But it is the case that everything is based on weeks. Forget your monthly. It's all based on weeks, which is I see it as a real contrast with when CJRS and furlough came in, if you remember the first draft of the guidelines, or first few drafts, where they talked about monthly paid employees, they absolutely didn't recognize the fact that weekly paid employees existed. So, you know, there's these two conflicting kind of routes that they've gone on. You know, one says weekly don't exist and the other says monthly don't exist. Furlough gradually learned to recognize the fact that there are people who are paid weekly. Didn't make it any easier, but at least they knew it was there. Rewrite 7, I think it was, when they made an appearance. Understand how each type of worker's holiday entitlement is calculated. There's not one size fits all. I think we've probably made that clear. There are general principles, and if it's a fixed pattern of work, then it's relatively easy to calculate an entitlement. When it comes to pay, something entirely different, but you know, if it's a relatively straightforward working pattern, then the entitlement won't be too difficult. If there is no clear working pattern, if you're a 0 hours worker, then yeah, all bets are off, really. Don't breach legislation. Very easy to say, not difficult to do when the legislation is unclear or absent. Use 52-week average. A best average is 0 hour contract. We'll come on to that in a moment. Be clear in your contracts to employees how their particular holiday will be calculated and paid. State annual leave year and reclaiming holiday terms, and avoid tribunals at all costs. Yeah, be interesting. We need some tribunals so that all these gaps can be tested, but we prefer it if it wasn't you guys. There's always plenty of people with more money than we've got who can take things through the courts, and if they get the right judge on the right day, we all get no more legislation as a consequence. Understand your workers' holiday entitlement for various categories of workers. So fixed weekly hours, quite easy. Monthly paid weekly hours, quite easy. Fixed hours and overtime. Entitlement wise, not too difficult. Because the complications arise in a week's pay and what you measure that as. Shift work and compressed hours, not too tough. Ad hoc hours and periodic term time contracts. Again, you know, if you've got annualized hours, for example, as is common in academic world, then, you know, you would work it slightly differently. The entitlements are quite clear and easy to calculate, but you then have to look at how you're going to pay them, when you're going to pay them, because often they'll be working for 37 weeks or 38 weeks or whatever it is, but paid over 12 months equally. So, you know, it's a difference. But yeah, limited to academic world, really. And then 0 hours contracts, where, as I say, very little fun could be had there. They may be very flexible and useful from a work point of view, but calculating holiday, no fun at all. So I reckon that might be time for a natural break. So yeah, we'll give it 5 minutes or so, just to, if you want to dive off and grab another glass of something a bit stronger. This is where you will need strong stuff. If you thought that was not great, it gets worse. Definitely gets worse. So yeah, give me a few minutes to yeah, just do what you need to do.